was young, I thought house painters painted houses. What did I know? I was a working guy.
The Irishman is the latest gangster drama by the incredible Martin Scorsese that stars Robert De Niro as Frank Sheeran, mob hitman who looks back at his past experiences working for Russell Bufalino, played fantastically by Joe Pesci, with an emphasis on his involvement with the fate of Jimmy Hoffa, played by Al Pacino, giving his best performance in years. At 3.5 hours, this sweeping gangster epic earns its runtime with its ambition, presenting a story that explores friendship and betrayal in a very quiet and subdued way. Because of this, it very much reminded me of my all-time favorite movie, Once Upon a Time in America, which is of course starting off on the right foot. The Irishman expands on many themes and ideas that are introduced in Goodfellas. I say this because this film will inevitably be compared to that masterpiece. Scorsese mirrors many shots and scenes and structures from Goodfellas, but it is for a much different purpose than that film. Martin Scorsese's gangster movies deliver messages that fall onto a spectrum. On one side of the spectrum, we get the message that a normal life is boring, and that the gangster life is much more exciting. This is where Goodfellas lies. On the other side of the spectrum, however, we get the message that crime does not pay. This is where The Departed lies.
Maybe. Maybe not. Maybe fuck yourself.
In my opinion, Casino would fall somewhere in the middle of that. So where does The Irishman fall on this spectrum? This is where things get interesting, because even though the film is structured more like Goodfellas, it most definitely falls onto the side of The Departed. Frank does make it out of the mob life alive, but that is essentially all he has. He has no family, no friends, nothing. The narration in The Irishman is more of a confession to try and absolve himself of his sins, as he does feel genuine regret, and thus protecting his soul from God. Whereas in Goodfellas, the narration is Henry Hill confessing on a witness stand, protecting himself from the law. I won't go into this too much, as there is already a fantastic video by Thomas Flight that goes more into these ideas directly, and I will leave the link to that video in the description. Robert De Niro gives one of his best performances in a long time as well, as he plays a much more quiet and subdued and low-key character as opposed to the characters he has played in other Martin Scorsese pictures like Jimmy Conway in Goodfellas, or Max Cady in Cape Fear. He says so much by saying so little with just his facial expressions, which is the mark of a great actor, and a very underrated quality in an actor nowadays. The same can be said of Joe Pesci, who plays a character who is pretty much the polar opposite of Tommy DeVito or Nick Santoro. He is still just as intimidating and commands the screen whenever he is on it, which is what makes him such a good actor. The man is 5'4", and yet he has such a commanding presence on the screen even when he is with actors who are nearly a foot taller than him. Al Pacino does provide a lot of the more energetic moments in the film though.
Fucking grand. At the same time, you let him sell insurance to his fucking father's... To his fucking father's... To his fucking father's locals! Damn it!
As Jimmy Hoffa, he provides a lot of the energy and comedy in a story like this, and it was a joy to see them on the screen together. One thing about this film that struck me in a very quiet way at first but grew louder the more I thought about it was how subtly it deconstructs the life of crime that Scorsese is so good at presenting. There are no heroes, and at the same time there are also no villains. This film is more concerned with the futility of crime. They look back on their past experiences and realize that in the end it was ultimately worthless. They either ended up in jail, dead, or they lived out the rest of their lives with nothing. And yet, despite the tragic nature of a story like this, we as the audience don't necessarily feel too sorry for the man, as we never forget that he is a sociopathic murderer at the end of the day. This is another thing that Martin Scorsese is so good at. He presents characters that are not role models in the least, and yet he does not manipulate you into feeling a certain way about them. He simply shows you people doing questionable things, and however you feel is however you feel. This leads me to my main point. It is all self-inflicted. Take the characters that pop into your mind when you think of Martin Scorsese's pictures. Jake LaMotta, Travis Bickle, Howard Hughes, Henry Hill, Jordan Belford, and our protagonist here, Frank Sheeran. Each of these characters is unable to escape their own demons and don't look introspectively enough before it is too late and they have lost everything. In The Irishman, Frank is forced by Bufalino to kill many people amongst other highly immoral and illegal things. Frank is the one who chooses to be involved with the mob life to begin with. This is shown very well in the first scene with Frank and Russell. This scene provides an excellent use of subtle foreshadowing into the future for Frank. More on this in just a second. Frank is the one who brings the destruction of his family on himself, which is why we ultimately do not pity him too much when he is an old man with nothing left. One of the ways that Martin Scorsese does this in The Irishman is through the use of foreshadowing. In the aforementioned scene with Russell and Frank meeting each other, Frank's truck breaks down on the road, and as fate would have it, the closest gas station is right across the street, and Russell happens to be hanging out with him there. It's a seemingly innocent scene, which makes us believe that Russell is a nice guy, but it immediately establishes that he is the boss of something, and a true gangster by the way he doesn't reveal his name. However, upon closer examination, there is a much more sinister subtext to it. This is noted by Frank's line,
I can drive him. I can't fix him.
This foreshadows that in the future, Frank is the one who does the dirty footwork, but doesn't see the big picture of what he is doing like Russell does, as he is never truly involved in it. After Russell's cousin Bill Buffalino, a lawyer played by Ray Romano, gets him off a case for delivering a shipment of meat to the restaurant that was owned by Russell, which is a nice way of saying he stole it. In the scene, Frank has dinner with Russell and asks him where he learned to speak Italian, to which he replies with,
Dove una rege come te ha insegnato a parlare l'italiano?
In Italia, la guerra.
We cut to a scene that takes place overseas during the actual war itself, where Frank makes two Nazis dig their own grave before shooting them so their dead bodies fall into the hole. This foreshadows the fact that by even accepting to work with Russell, Frank is digging his own grave, and his eventual killing of Jimmy Hoffa is the final nail in his coffin. Another thing about The Irishman that struck me was the fact that the death scenes are very quick and sudden. There is no overly sentimental music that plays, no monologue preceding or proceeding the deaths, no quick cuts, just bam, gone. This lack of cuts throughout the death scenes reminds us of how fast a human life can end. 1 second you have all your thoughts, ambitions, and memories, and the next it is all gone, just like that. This is shown most perfectly in the scene of Jimmy Hoffa's death. Up to that point, Jimmy Hoffa has been in the film for 2 hours, the length of many other movies, and just like that, he is gone. What makes this scene so tragic is the fact that Jimmy honestly trusts Frank up until the very end. The fact that he says, "Let's get out of here," shows that he does genuinely care about Frank's safety just as much as he does about his own. You can also tell that Frank does not want to kill Jimmy, as he is about to raise his gun, but doesn't because he does not want to have to do this. But again, just like that. This scene is ultimately the beginning of the end for Frank's life as he knows it, as everything past this point really shows how much he loses in life after killing Hoffa. In the end, Frank has nothing but his own thoughts and regrets. Despite how much he did for the Buffalino crime family, in the end, it was all for nothing. This futility isn't only reflected with Frank and Jimmy's friendship, but it's also reflected in the relationship Frank has with his family. He is never really present for much, and obviously has a very warped sense of paternity. This is shown in the admittedly heavily criticized scene where he beats up the store owner. Now, I agree with most of the criticisms that people have for this scene. It doesn't detract from this masterpiece, but I definitely agree that they should have gotten a body double, as it just does not look as convincing as it should. It is most definitely a far cry from the beatdown that Robert De Niro and Joe Pesci give to Billy Batts in Goodfellas. This scene is still very important to the story, as it cements a growing disconnect between Peggy and Frank. She looks at how he handles conflict with a look of fear, and this results in her and the rest of the family being so scared to go to him with anything if they need help with something. This is explored further in the scene in the bowling alley, where Frank and Russell try to be nice to her and make her feel like she is part of the family, but you can most certainly tell from the little girl's acting that she is just not having it and does not feel comfortable with either of them, because she knows that they are both involved in very scary grown-up business. Peggy actually does take a liking to Jimmy, because she sees all the paternal qualities in him that Frank simply does not have. They share ice cream together and get along really well. Coming back to the most pivotal scene in the film, when Frank kills Jimmy Hoffa, it is the nail in the coffin for their relationship. Anna Paquin, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing her name, only has around 7 lines in the entire film, but she manages to say so much while saying so little. She doesn't talk to him after that, and their relationship is over. Frank didn't realize what would happen to his family because of his actions, because he was so uninvolved in the consequences of what he was doing, despite being at the center of it all. While he and Russell are in prison, in one of the saddest scenes in the film, Russell says,
Jimmy was a good man. You know? A nice family, too, huh? Yeah.
Hold on.
I never wanted it to go that far. Never. I picked us over him. Fuck him. Fuck him.
he and Frank both clearly look back at the life that they have lived with nothing but regret. In the scenes that follow, Frank and Russell are filmed from farther away or at an angle to make them look small. Russell is taken away after his health starts failing further and he dies off screen. Frank was never able to say goodbye to him. This further illustrates the preciousness of human life and how quickly it can end. Much like Jake LaMotta in Raging Bull, there is too little introspection too late. After Frank gets out, he tries to talk to his other daughters, Dolores. After this, he tries to go to the bank that Peggy works at, and she wants nothing to do with him. Frank again is shown in a small manner, hobbling away on a cane. Frank is shown in the twilight of his life, picking out the coffin he wants to rest in when he passes, as well as various scenes with the nurse in the nursing home. He tries to confess his sins to a priest, but we can infer that he knows he can't right his wrongs, so his delivery of the confession comes off as insincere. I have seen some people criticize Robert De Niro's performance in the final scenes as being too mumbly, but I feel that this is a very invalid criticism, as the film is aiming to be as realistic as possible, and if you have ever talked to an old man in your life, that is what they do. They mumble. In the final scene of the film, he prays one last time, and as the priest leaves, we can see that he has a picture of Peggy next to the lamp. He requests that the priest leaves the door open, which is a callback to when Frank was a bodyguard for Jimmy, and he would have him leave the door open. Despite everything that he did, he destroyed everything that meant anything to him, and in the end is left with nothing. He has no friends left, no family that would come visit him, nothing meaningful or sentimental other than that picture of Peggy, his wife, and Dolores left, thus ultimately illustrating the futility of crime. Hey guys, thanks for watching. The Irishman is my favorite movie of the year, and it most definitely earns this long runtime with incredible performances from all of its leads. It is definitely a challenging movie to watch, but at the same time, it has a nice and cozy vibe to most of it. If you like this video, go ahead and leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more analysis videos like this one. See you around.